So here we have a 2010 Honda Crosstour, or a Accord Crosstour, and it has a complaint of a torque converter shudder at light throttle cruising speeds. I had it in a few weeks ago, back in June, and as far as I could tell, it was a torque converter clutch slipping inside the torque converter, or when the clutch would apply. There were no fault codes related to it. I did find a TSB on it from Honda, and they had extended the policy adjustment on the torque converter for this problem. Unfortunately, it's outside of the limitations of that policy adjustment. So we have a new torque converter to put in this thing. That means removing the transaxle. Now this is an all-wheel drive, so there is a small transfer case here that has to be removed, as near as I could tell, because the subframe has to be dropped. The engine has to be supported from the top, and then this whole K-frame or subframe, lower control arms, has to be dropped as an assembly. So I've sprayed everything with penetrating fluid in preparation for this. The exhaust has to be dropped, so these bolts have to be removed, or the nuts have to be removed. And we're going to take it apart at the back of the catalytic converter here, because a little easier to access the bolts, I think. Either way, they're rusty on either side. The front pipe has to be removed, so I'll have to heat those nuts up. And this is the upper knuckles and strut should stay there. CV shafts have to be removed, and then the transaxle is dropped in preparation to change the converter. So we'll pick up when we get some more parts off. Remove the tie rod nuts. A couple of sharp strikes here to the cast knuckle will release the tie rod, but the ball joints, I'd like to use a release puller here. It's like a small mini pitman arm puller. That way we don't damage the boots here, and put the nut back on so that it doesn't damage the end of the stud. Usually this will take them off. They have to be released. So I'm going to demonstrate this puller. Put the nut back on there so it doesn't slip off. Put a little bit of torque on the end of the bolt. And release it just like that. Sometimes you do have to hit it with a hammer. But that way there we don't damage the boot, and the ball joint can be used again. So remove the two 36mm axle nuts, and you see how this axle shaft just pressed in from this side. Well, we ran into the first snafu on this job. This one's rusted in here, and I'm trying to use a puller to push it through, because it just should push right through, but it's not doing that. So I don't want to damage the threads on this puller. I've done several already. I do have a bigger tool, so maybe I'll try that one. So this seems to be winning, which is a good thing, because I only have another 1/4 inch of stud to go here, or bolt to go here. But that's as far as it'll go now. So it came loose with this puller tool that I bought several months ago. The other one would have just stripped the threads. So disconnect it at the lower ball joint now that it's broken free, and pull the control arm down while you lift up on the steering knuckle, disengage it from the ball joint, and then secure it with, I use those reusable tie straps to secure it from the spring here. So all of this stuff is going to stay with the vehicle, and the subframe, steering gear, steering shaft, tie rod ends is going to come out with the subframe. And now I'm going to go to the top and support the engine. So remove the battery, lower battery tray, air induction duct that sits right here with a couple of clips, air cleaner, air induction hose, and the lower part of the air filter housing so that we can access the top tranny mount. I think I read something in the service literature about not removing this center bolt here. It said if you remove this bolt, you may have to replace the entire mount, but I'm going to double check. I wouldn't remove it anyways because I can get at the 3 bolts that hold the entire mount to the body, so I'd take it off there and these 2 bolts over here. So we've got to figure out a way to support this engine. I don't see any engine lifting eyes on this thing. Oh yeah, there's one there. So we got that one there. And what are we going to use to lift on for the other side? Have to see what it calls for in the literature. So I removed the upper rear transmission mount as an assembly. You can see it right here on the floor. And I'm going to remove this lower battery tray box. There's 2 bolts in the corner here that I've removed, and there's 2 more underneath here. Now with the tranny mount out of the way, it's a little easier to get at those 2 bolts. So we'll take those out. That'll give us a little bit more room in this area. Still haven't figured out how we're going to support this engine yet, but we'll figure something out. Well, that was fun. That metal piece comes out with a lower air induction duct. And you can see there's a bolt going down from the top side here. I don't know why they did that. Although I didn't see this bracket, I could have taken it off here, I suppose. But this whole plastic duct will come out if you undo the shift linkage and put the transmission shift lever into, I would imagine, low. And then this boot going into the inner fender here is just a rubber seal. And we're going to put that back in there. And we got lots of room now. Starter has to come out. Still haven't figured out where to hold this engine. We'll figure that out next. So there's the starter. It comes out after you remove a small bracket here. Disconnect this wiring and disconnect this sensor on the front of the transmission. I'm not sure what kind of sensor that is. Speed sensor, position sensor. And there's a gasket in here on this for whatever reason, and it's a shim steel gasket, so I imagine it adjusts the clearance. So the front of the engine sits on a motor mount in the front here, which sits on the body of the vehicle. So the front of the engine doesn't need to be supported. Only the rear needs to be supported when I remove the 2 lower motor mounts. And this is what I've decided to do. I've got this fixture mounted across between the towers, the shock towers, and this brace going across here. This nylon strap around the aluminum intake manifold, and that should be perfectly fine to hold the back of the engine up while we remove the necessary components to remove the transaxle when we get to that point. So I'm going to lift it up now and start removing the exhaust and the rear drive shaft. So there's the exhaust pipe with the forward catalytic converter. 3 nuts at the back, 6 nuts at the front pipes. Had to heat them. Here's the nuts here. You can see I split 3 of them. The ones on the cat, I split them with an air chisel to get them off, and then heated the other ones. Tied up the back of the exhaust to the hanger bearing here, and then removed the front drive shaft, mark it with some paint or a center punch. Now I'm hoping I can leave the drive shaft supported here, and that when this cradle comes down I can move it forward enough to clear it. I removed the fasteners that hold the transfer case, I'd call it a transfer case, the rear drive unit, onto the side, and it's ready to come off. So I'm having difficulty getting the transfer case out of this Honda Crosstour, and I'm looking for the procedure here. And I don't find it. The only thing that comes up in Identifix under Honda Crosstour transfer case is moving an automatic transmission and transfer case fill and change the oil, basically, parts and labor. There's nothing in here. Let's have a look at the service procedure to R&R the transmission. So here's the automatic transmission removal procedure for a V6 automatic. It says you need a support fixture and a whole bunch of other tooling. Remove the battery, remove the splash separator, remove the front grille, remove the air cleaner housing, remove the front splash shield, drain the transmission fluid, remove the brace, remove the positive battery cable from the starter, remove the harness, remove the starter, remove the shift linkage from the shifter. I've done all this stuff. Disconnect connectors. A bunch of transmission connectors. Disconnect the hoses, pressure switches, cooler lines, brackets. Support the engine with a fixture. There's their fancy fixture. Picks up on both cylinder heads, one on each side with a bunch of service adapters. Remove the front engine mount. Why? I don't know why you'd have to remove that, because it supports the front of the engine. Remove the exhaust, which I've done. Undo the lower strut bolts, the lower shocks, or lower strut and the lower ball joint. Power steering lines. Disconnect the steering gear from the subframe. Take the torque converter bolts out, shield off the torque converter. Subframe attachment bolts, fixture on the tranny jack to hold the subframe, tie it down, raise it to support the steering box, and then drop the subframe. It doesn't mention anything about the transfer case and the rear drive shaft. Then once that's out, you can remove the axle shafts. The trouble is you can't drop the transfer case, or you can't drop the subframe with the transfer case in place. I'm going to show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so I've got the drive shaft disconnected, as I noted previously, marked, and I've removed all the fasteners. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fasteners. There's one little tube up above there and one bolt on top. So all the bolts are out, and to me it should just pry out of here. I suspect that it's corroded in the case. I've tried with a chisel and a pry bar in here. I don't want to damage the transmission case, and I haven't missed any fixtures, any bolts. I mean, these bolts here hold the right or the left side of the transfer case bearings in. It should come out as an assembly as far as I can tell. I'm going to look for a different model with the same or similar transfer case. So here's an Acura MDX, which has a very similar drivetrain in it, and here's transfer case removal in that. So basically remove a cover, drain the fluid, remove the subframe stiffener, which I don't have, remove the exhaust pipe. The exhaust looks exactly the same as this Crosstour. Remove the bolt securing the breather. I have that breather and I've taken that off. Separate the propeller shaft from the flange, which I've done, mark it, and then remove the transfer case. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bolts. Well, I'm going to double check to make sure I didn't miss any bolts, but I don't think I have. So as far as I can tell, that's just stuck in there. So we'll have to look a little closer, make sure I haven't missed any bolts. Well, I haven't missed any bolts. I've gone around it 3 or 4 times now. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bolts on this case assembly. And I tried putting a pry bar in between here and the transmission, and it wouldn't move. So now I'm using a cold chisel as a wedge, and it's starting to actually crack free. I've got a couple of bolts in here to kind of keep it from falling out. I don't think it's going to fall out, but it just bothers me that it's that tight. I suspect it's corroded into the aluminum housing. So I've managed to get it separated about 1/16 of an inch down here and up here by using a cold chisel as a wedge between the back of this bolt and that surface there. And I've got it separated, so it's still tight on there, and it's not coming apart at the top, which bothers me. So I've sprayed this down with penetrating fluid, and I'm going to leave it for the night. I'm done for the day, so I'm going to let it sit till tomorrow morning and see if it'll remove a little easier after that penetrating fluid maybe has had a chance to work its way or creep its way into that aluminum housing. So there's the what they call a transfer case removed from this transmission. You can see the area around here where it fits snugly into the transmission case. It's all oxidized, plus there's a dowel on the top here. So getting it pressed apart by putting a pry bar in between the case and these bolts was what helped. There's a couple of ears here. I'm sure if you hit those ears you would have just snapped the case, broke it off. So these bolts being bent up a little bit on the end here is not going to hurt anything. We'll make sure we put some never sees on this, and hopefully it isn't a problem in the future. Of course, the transmission fluid should have been drained beforehand, but nevertheless it did get drained when I pulled that out. So here's a look at the transmission with the transfer case out. You can see that the back of the transfer case would come up to here, so wouldn't allow the subframe to come down like it will now with the transfer case off. And it was seized, rusted, corroded in that area around the outside of this aluminum case here. I don't know why they made it such an interference fit, but nevertheless, it's off now. We can continue on with this disassembly. Remove the forward plastic shield, a whole bunch of these plastic push pins. There are 2 bolts on this bracket here that can be removed. I suppose you could leave them in. It is slotted, but I figured why not just take them right out. Now there's 4 bolts or 6 bolts that hold the power steering gear. You can see one in here, one up there. Can't see it very well, but it's in there, and one down below that we have to get out on each side. Power steering hose is disconnected at the frame on the front on the right wheel. And the steering gear, I believe, stays in the vehicle, so we don't have to worry about the steering coupler or the steering lines. But it's going to be a challenge getting at those 6 bolts. So undo the hood prop rods or prop cylinders and tilt the hood back. Support it with some suitable fixture. I've got a piece of steel pipe in there holding it up. And with a long extension, you can reach down here and get the back bolts on the steering gear. There's one, they're 19 mil, the heads, or 3/4. And then there's a couple more on the other side. There's 4 on the other side that are 17 mil or 11/16. So this aluminum steering gear, and it's actually the rear motor mount against the firewall, is going to stay up there attached to the engine. Subframe is going to drop down and hopefully come forward and down to clear this drive shaft. I have to remove 4 bolts on this engine mount. Is there 4 or 3? No, there's 4. So we'll give them a little shot of penetrating fluid. They go in from the bottom, or in the top by the looks of it. Where are those nuts? They look like they might be welded on there. Well, we're going to try removing the nuts and see what happens. So there are 4 bolts that go in from the top on the front motor mount, right beside the catalytic converter behind the rad here, and you get at them with a long extension and a 14 mil flex socket. They could have put them in from the bottom. That would have made it a lot easier, but oh well. At least you can get an impact gun on them. So I think I'm ready to drop the subframe. I've got a tranny jack here with a couple of pieces of 1.25" square tubing bolted to the top and just semi-secured so that it can't slip off. It shouldn't anyways. Now we have to remove the bolts that hold the subframe. The engine is being supported from the top by the fixture up above. So there's another support at the back of the transaxle back here. After you remove the 4 large cradle bolts and 4 small cradle bolts out of the front corners and back corners, it should be ready to lower the subframe now. Gonna take a ladder and go up and have a check on that end support, make sure it's okay. Well, I was right. If you drop it down about 3 inches, you can pull it forward enough to clear the front of the drive shaft going to the rear. So you got to sneak it around there. Of course, the steering gear and the bracket that holds the steering gear and the rear motor mount and everything is still up there. I left this tranny cooler line attached because there was 2 small bolts here, and I left the power steering line attached. It can stay there, it doesn't need to come off. In fact, now that I look at it, they said to disconnect this because they wanted to remove it, so I didn't even need to disconnect this because obviously it's still sitting there, right? So they wanted you to remove that power steering cooler line. So there we are. The next step is to remove the axle shafts and the transaxle. Remove the torque converter bolt access hole, access plate. There's 10mm bolt, 10mm bolt. Then there are 8 bolts around the circumference of the torque converter here. It looks like the flywheel ring gear is actually on the torque converter. Then 4 bolts on the bottom here. There's a steel guard over top of the crank sensor here that has to be removed to access this 1 bolt. And it looks like the wiring harness is clipped up there, so we're going to have to unclip it so that we can reposition it to get this 1 bolt out. Well, carry on. So remove the right outer CV shaft, a sharp wrap right here with a mallet. We'll dislodge the C-clip. Remove the intermediate shaft's bearing insulator. You can't take it out of there because the catalytic converter is right here, but you can slide it this way to access this bolt and this way to access these 2 bolts in here. These are special shouldered bolts, or 2 of them are shouldered bolts, so make note of where they go because they actually go in these 2 holes. Then you can slide the intermediate shaft out of the transaxle past the connector for the crank sensor. It's really close, so you have to actually put the connector back in its location. And well, we're continuing on here. We're pretty much done at the bottom here. All the stuff is off on this side. We could take the CV shaft out on this side now. Let's see. Yeah, we might as well take the CV shaft out on this side. Well, I almost missed that 1 bolt up above the axle shaft there. That has to obviously be removed as well. I don't see any other fasteners going from the engine into the transaxle, unless there's one up on this side too. Doesn't appear to be. But that motor mount does cross over both the bell housing and the engine case and the actual bell housing of the transmission, so we're probably going to have to remove this motor mount as well. So there's the front motor mount. There is a shield over top of it for heat protection. That has to come off with these 2 nuts. Then this center bolt comes out and the motor mount drops out through the bottom. Then the bracket comes off the engine with 3 fasteners. And behind the bracket is another bolt going through the engine into the transmission. So you had no choice. That had to be removed. No question about it. So I have all the bell housing bolts out. Torque converter disconnected. Wiring harnesses unclipped. Lots of connectors. Got the tranny jack in place. I'm ready to take the transmission down. So there's the transaxle out. There's the back of the engine. You can see there are 2 top torque converter or transmission bell housing bolts, and the rest of the bolts go through from the engine side. I see dowel pin stayed in the engine. Looks like looks like there's only 1 dowel. Oh no, there's a dowel pin here as well. Whenever you remove a transmission, I mean, we're putting the same one back in, but you always want to watch those dowel pins. Sometimes a dowel pin will stay with the transmission, and if you're putting in a reman unit and the dowel pin is in the old transmission case and you don't notice it, then you'll end up with slight misalignment between the transmission and the back of the engine, which results in usually a flywheel cracking or breaking because of the stresses on it. The dowel pins are there to ensure that they're aligned because the bolts don't do a good job. Here's the torque converter. We have a new converter to put in this thing and new seals to put in it. So basically everything is the reverse of what we've done so far. Just put everything back. So I'm going to leave the tranny right where it's sitting because there's no point taking it off of there. It's sitting pretty well where it needs to be sitting. Of course, I spilled some tranny fluid on the floor, so we'll move it out of the way and clean up the floor. So there's a new torque converter installed. When you're putting it in, push it in straight and make sure it goes all the way in. It has to be in about almost a 1/4 inch inside of the bell housing. It'll stop several times on the way in as it's trying to engage with various shafts and including the transmission front pump. So it's important that it's all the way in, otherwise you'll damage the front pump when you bolt it up. So we're ready to reinstall. I'm going to put a little bit of lubricant around the nose of this just so it doesn't rust in there, and in case somebody ever has to take it apart. Clean up this gasket surface here for the starter as well as these surfaces here. So the tranny's back in. Make sure the dowel pins are lined up. These bell housing bolts are 54 foot-pounds, and these little 6mm bolts that hold the torque converter to the flex plate are 8.7 foot-pounds, which isn't very much. Yeah, everything looks, all those bolts are in. I got the 2 bolts left up top. Put dielectric grease in all the electrical connectors. Blow out any dust that might be in there just in case, because it'll prevent the seal from going in properly. And basically continue reinstalling everything. So transmission's back in, axle shafts are reinstalled, front motor mount is in, bolts that hold the steering gear down are all cleaned and never seized in the holes for all the bolt holes here. And I'm ready to lift this subframe back up. I've actually got the rear tranny mount installed on top up there, so it's a lot more secure than it was before. It's not just hanging on that intake manifold. Well, it's all back together and running again. Just come back from a road test. Transmission seems to shift fine. No more shudder from the torque converter at light throttle acceleration. Just going to double check the fluid level and have a quick look underneath, make sure there's nothing leaking. I'm sure it's okay.